Awesome. All right. So welcome to the inaugural OpenSLO meeting. In the meeting invite, we had the agenda, if everyone has that. I think the two big things I wanted to talk about with everyone is one, kind of establishing a roadmap. And secondly, kind of a governance model, not necessarily like deciding on one now, but planting that seed of how we want to kind of move forward with that. Taking first things first, talking about a roadmap. What are people interested in seeing on a roadmap? What are the kind of the important first steps that we see that we want to do with this? We kind of have the foundational pieces here, but what are some other like key pieces that we want to add?
I think I don't know if it's the standard format has been validated so far, but what I would like to have in a short or midterm is to have a format that is aligned with most of the various use cases from our community, suggested to our community, and then once we have it, we can sort of shape that format that takes all the inputs that we could have collected individually on the various use cases. Like I said, not only on just prod use cases, but also non-prod and prod use cases.
I think that's definitely a thing we want to make sure we're doing, because one of the like things that we need to do with that is more dynamic type validation and checking. Like one of the things that I think one of the issues we have right now is that, like, for a ratio metric, your numerator and denominator query cannot be the same, because logically that doesn't make sense. And so putting that in there, so like Henrik, to your point, that would be a good use case to have validation and kind of create those guardrails.
Another thing that I was presenting in my SLOconf talk was the separation of concerns between what are the actual queries, so what is the data and where does the data come from, and how do I retrieve the data, with what do I do with the data. So I think right now, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think you've just taken the definition of what you have in Noble 9 and kind of open source that, and that was obviously driven by what you have built. And I think what we are seeing is that we want to make sure that the SLO definition can stay independent of the underlying data source, where the data comes from. And this is why we on the Captain side, we have been, I think, at least retrieving positive feedback on separating SLIs and SLOs.
Yeah, I actually will say that was one of, so when we were doing this, when I was doing this, that was actually one of the big things I wanted to make sure we did, was that separate, and we kind of purposely did not put in the we didn't put in like the kind of implementation detail of the, like, how do you get that data, how do you fetch that data, because like in Noble 9 we have like an agent-based model. Somebody else might have something else, and so that like data source definition is purposely for now not in there. Because also there could be a use case where, like, let's say you're in something like Datadog or New Relic, and you're defining you're using the OpenSLO spec to define your SLOs. In that context, you wouldn't necessarily need to have that data source like connection string defined.
I know I'm not talking about the connection string. I'm talking, maybe I don't know the latest version of it, but I thought the query language itself, like you specified the query that is specific to that data source, correct?
Yes.
So and I think this is what we have separated. So we basically say in the SLO, I want to have an SLO on response time. How I query response time is defined somewhere else that is then specific to the actual tool.
Oh, okay. So abstract that query.
Yeah, basically the SLI will be more technical on how to retrieve the data that you're looking for, and the SLO is basically what are your requirements?
Yeah.
Okay,
because the thing is, if I'm, let's say, I'm taking the business owner hat, if I'm the business owner and I want to define an SLO and response time, why do I need to know the PromQL? Why do I need to look at a file that has a strange query language that I don't understand? So I rather have the separation where one can define these are my objectives, and then somebody else figures out how do we get this data. And this is kind of the separation of concerns. And maybe I was not making myself clear earlier what we mean with this. Yeah.
No, I kind of get what you're saying. Kind of like I'm trying to remember the Cucumber markup language where you define like your you know, in your BDD steps, and it's kind of an abstraction, and then the implementation of that. Gherkin. So like Gherkin is like kind of a higher level language that like business owners and product owners can define what those requirements are, and then the implementation is elsewhere. Is that kind of like what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm referencing an SLI with a name, and then the way I can query the SLI is defined somewhere else, also by probably somebody else.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Then there's
interesting because we went a different direction where we said that we have the idea of a product owner and then the idea of a product team that does engineering work. And so we say the product owner should sit with the product team at the same time when the team goes through planning of what are we going to make a promise about? What would the target be of that promise? And so during the planning session, we sit together and the goal would be that there's a config file or config language they can use to make that a reality together right there when they're talking about feasibility of, is it feasible for the backends to meet the threshold? You know, we don't have these response codes, like the engineers can talk about that too. So that's just what we do, at least on our side.
Yeah, we just felt that we don't want to bring tool-specific data into a file that defines what you want to do with the result of the query, right? I mean, this felt strange. Why do I need? And then I'm sharing this file, and then it might be edited by somebody that wants to change the limit or the SLO, you know, to a different value, and all of a sudden they have to touch a file that also contains query strings, and what if they mess things up? It's the same if you look at the Jenkins pipeline. Why in a Jenkins pipeline do I have, I don't know, you know, Helm charts, or why do I have YAML files in there that are deployment specific? I want to have a pipeline that defines the process, but how the individual steps are executed should be taken care by somebody completely different. And also, if you separate it, you can, at least in theory, swap out the tooling without changing the process. That was the thinking. Now, is this perfect for everyone? I'm sure there will be people that say, no, I want to have everything in one file because we are, I don't know, a small team and we are kind of doing everything together. But this is at least what I was thinking, right? Especially with large enterprises where you have some teams that are responsible for monitoring, they can give you the queries. And then there's another team that you onboard on the SLO concept. And then they just say, okay, these are the 10 metrics that I have available by name, and I now only need to specify my thresholds. That's great.
I think it makes sense because the service is already a separate kind at this point, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like there's the SLO type and then there's the service type. So it would make sense to separate the indicator as well, I guess. Because I think we already do have two types, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you're right. You're correct. We have the two. We have the yeah, you're right. We have the service and the SLO.
Yeah, and that's tough because in the system we're making, we have an agent-based system that's producing the raw metric, and when you configure the promise, that's when it's getting pushed down to the agent layer, where then every single time your app's running or doing the thing that needs to be measured, it's both emitting the raw metric series where you can use for detailed RCA, as well as the binary check of did this interaction pass or fail.
So that's I could see where. Okay, so that's done by the agent as well, the check itself.
Yeah, the check itself is done by the library or the middleware that's parsing the raw logs that then emits the metric for you.
Yeah,
but that's the theory there.
Yeah, but in the end, it's still an implementation detail. I think we need to still figure out what do we want for the end user, because if we are specifying an open spec, in the end, as an end user, I want to know how can I define my SLIs and my SLOs. And if one tool decides to send everything down to the agent because this is where all the magic happens, then be it. If another tool decides they're separating it, like we do it on the captain side, then
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the need to do it two different ways there.
Yeah, but I don't want to dictate either, right? I think that's the challenge now, because obviously we have two different approaches. And so the question is, do we find a common ground? Do we want to take an existing implementation from you guys and start from there? We have a different approach, and now trying to make a standard of two different approaches will obviously be interesting. And the question is, if we as the tool vendors should, or tool implementers should decide, or if we need more end users. Because in the end, we need to define something that makes sense for the end users, and not just because we have an implementation that already works with a certain spec, and therefore we favor that implementation.
So do you plan on like actually putting authorization in front of these different types, like where product managers can't touch the indicator files, but can only kind of like modify, for example, the SLO, like the objective itself? Stuff like that, like, because I think then that's like more feasible in with that approach, right?
Exactly. That was the initial idea, right? Because we've seen so many, especially with we ran into challenges with Jenkins files internally, and we saw that certain people have to touch files like a Jenkins file that contains process logic, tool integration, and all of a sudden a developer can change things that they shouldn't be able to change because everything is in one file, and you cannot just have access control on parts of the file. This was also our thinking.
Yeah, and the other advantage of separating, you say, oh, today I'm using Prometheus, and next month we are going to purchase a new product. So I don't want to touch everything. I just have to go back to the SLI file and just change the way the name of my metric is the same, but the way I'm retrieving it is different. But at the end, it's the same metric. It's just that the data source is different.
I like that.
And the other thing that I also was using a lot with Captain when we're doing performance engineering, and I thought it was just perfect for performance engineers, is when you have to automatically validate something, you apply a lot of various, obviously for performance testing, you don't do a few SLO, or you're going to do lots of them based on response times, on health metrics, resource, blah, 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 blah. But then again, there are objectives that are more important than the others. So the notion of weight. So let's say the response times of buying this product is super crucial, because if it fails, we don't go to production. If, for example, I have IO activity, okay, I can tolerate if there is something. But basically, having notion of from 10 SLOs, defining the level of importance between each of them, I think it's also important.
No, that part actually makes a lot of sense too. Yeah, like you said, not every SLO has the same weight, and carries the same kind of, I guess, weight.
Do you have this concept? Is it, by the way, in there right now to have multiple SLOs and then calculate and aggregate across it and with an overall score? Is this
not in Noble 9 currently? No.
Yeah. Okay.
You are able to, like, for the oh my gosh, I'm forgetting. Hold on. One type, we are able to have kind of multiple indicators per SLO, but not across multiple SLOs. So like, if the if you have a latency or error rate and that whatever multiple SLOs you have, we can't aggregate there, but you can. It's the threshold metric, so we are able to have here within a multiple SLO, within a single SLO.
Okay. I mean, have you received feedback from your end users that are using your product about these requirements, or are we the only ones? Because we are bringing in maybe the different angle from, especially performance engineering.
I haven't heard anything about this. I was actually just in our product ideation Jira project right now, and I didn't see anything about that. So yeah, this might be a kind of a new use case. So But also, I think a lot of the customers that we're talking to are kind of beginning on their journey of SLOs, or just starting to implement them. So I don't know if they've gotten to this level of kind of need yet.
Yeah, but I think clearly, right, becoming, I mean, all of these kind of requirements are heavily driven by what we think will help, especially performance engineers that try to automate the analysis of a lot of metrics that come out of a performance test, a chaos test, something they do. And it can even be obviously some, kind of a test in production if you're doing, shadow deployments or something like that. But you want to basically analyze a list of SLOs, and then you want to make a decision on, are you good to go to the next stage, yes or no?
Yeah.
And our value prop has always been, you can build a dashboard with 50 metrics and you can look at this dashboard and then make a good or no good decision. Or you can say, what are your objectives for every single metric on that dashboard? And then we automate it. And we write this basically down as an SLO definition or as a list of SLOs with weights, right? You can weight individual metrics. That's kind of what we did.
No, I think that's a really good idea. I like that a lot. I know that there's some thing, Alex Hidalgo here, I know he's done some more sophisticated workflows like that. But yeah, no, I think we definitely need to get the tooling up and get, OpenSLO up to that. Well, he would kill me if he heard me say OpenSLO. It's OpenSLO. He's very particular. It's SLO, not slow. But yeah, the tooling, I think we need to get up to that. But I also really like that kind of idea of aggregating them, have the thumbs up, thumbs down. Because that was actually go ahead.
I got a question on, because another, I think, unique kind of uniqueness from our angle, Hendrik, is that the time frame of our evaluation, is not days or weeks or months, but it's typically, minutes or hours, because you're in a performance engineering side, you are analyzing the time frame of a performance test, of a load test, right? And that may run, it can be super fast, like 5-10 minutes if you do a quick test, and then you're looking at the key SLOs for this particular time frame, then make a decision, or it might be an hour. So I think for us, what we've been doing on the Captain side, we don't specify a time frame, a default time frame, but the time frame is always kind of being passed in when it's time for the evaluation, and it's decided by the load test, because it says my test ran an hour, so please now do the evaluation. So that's one thing that might be different. And the second thing, I'm not sure if you have this already in there as well, it's also about regression detection. So that means we are not only using SLOs where we say my SLO has to be 100 milliseconds or is 100 milliseconds in terms of response time, but I can also say 100 milliseconds is my SLO. But if I use SLOs as part of my performance evaluation in my pipeline, then I also want to be notified if all of a sudden response time goes from, let's say, 60 to 80. So that means if the jump is more than 10 or 20%, because I want to immediately be notified. Because a lot of people, at least what we see, some of them don't really know the individual metrics. So why should I sit down and now define thresholds if I don't really know? What I do know is I want to catch a regression early on. And this is where a lot of our users start with, okay, these are 10 metrics. I don't really yet know the thresholds, but what I want to know is, or what I do know is, I want to be notified in case I have, let's say, a 10% deviation from the previous timeframes.
Yeah, and then the big question when you do comparison is, say, do I compare to the previous one, to the baseline, to the last 20 last tests? Then when you introduce the notion of comparison, then our community will suddenly say, okay, I want to compare it, but to what? So then there's this need of defining the last positive results will be like considered like the one to compare to.
And
this is actually,
I'm also just reading Rob is I think chatting. It's different than the burn rate, exactly. So what we don't in the pre-prod environment, there is no error budget. I mean, it's not in the sense that you have the error budget in production, right? That's the difference here. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so our system is a discrete system. And I appreciate the value of a continuous system though, because you can do things like that underneath, because then you have the whole question of you want to detect it. And then if you break over the limit for any one interaction, that ends up into like a different set of math of predicting what's the actual underlying rate itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us, we chose to, again, keep that beneath the surface and do it in KPI, you know, predictive modeling and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a fascinating idea about how to track, are we trending in the wrong direction? One thing I would advise is don't just use the prior sample. Try and train it against multiple prior samples.
Exactly.
So our internal teams have been looking at stuff that does that kind of detection where you do a seasonal analysis on it. So you can have enough prior samples and you can say, I build every so often. So if I'm building every hour or every week, there's ways you can look at it and look at the previous N samples you have, because each fingerprint then represents like a discrete check against your system.
Exactly. And what we do is you can specify, as Henrik said, you can either say, you know, look at the last 5, but you can also say only look at those 5 that were actually considered good. Because when we take a sample, like as you said, like when we evaluate, we come up with a total score of that evaluation. And so if a new evaluation happens, you can say, compare these values against, let's say, the last 3 that were all considered good, because I don't want to compare myself against something that was bad earlier. So that's also, but I'm sure there's even cleverer models possible. Right now, that's what we do, right? You can say 1 or many, and then all of the previous ones, or only those that are good, or we also have a warning stage and the fail stage. Yeah.
This is actually similar to a discussion we were having with a client the other day, where we're, you know, for at least the alerting part of it, we're talking about either like the hard number or percentage or something like that. And they were asking, I think what they were trying to ask was, is there a way of doing a delta between what the current and historic value is? Because they have like known events that happen, like cyclical events during the calendar year. And, you know, it may dip down, like say a burn rate dips down faster during this time. It's a known thing, but they wouldn't necessarily want certain SLOs to be violated. So what they're looking for is like a delta from a historic calendar. But I think that this is I think these are all kind of like similar kind of ideas, where it's not the kind of current state, but it's more historical. How do we handle that?
Do you have then the option in Noble 9 to exclude time ranges and remove time ranges when you know, like, let's say there was somebody did the wrong thing at 8 o'clock in the morning, and so please remove that hour or something like that?
No, but one of the things we're talking about is being able to do that. So like if you're doing like chaos testing, so if you're like running a game day and you don't want to have that hit into your error budget, you probably do, because that's what the error budgets are for. But for whatever reason, if you know that there's going to be like a system outage or something like that,
this is obviously something. This is something obviously that doesn't go into the SLO definition. This is just outside of the SLO definition. This is just where you have, like, say, maintenance windows or special events. Yeah.
I think, but I think that's also kind of a having to have that option is also a philosophical question too, because it's like that's kind of what error budgets are for. And if you exclude something, it should kind of be part of your error budget. But it's kind of an ongoing discussion, because we do have clients that kind of want that, so we're kind of debating that.
I'm just putting something on the table. I don't know if it's relevant, but I'm just wondering. Is there a need for SLO per location?
Totally, absolutely. So I work for a retailer who operates things all over the country, right? And in some parts of the country, internet access is not as fast as everywhere else. And so site-based SLO is a common problem for anybody who operates sites everywhere, because access to the backbone is not necessarily the same speed, for example.
Yeah.
So
that's why I thought that maybe also precising which location. I mean, if it's a production. SLO. For example, if I have a user coming from Singapore or from, I don't know, East Coast or Europe, maybe they are users that are more gentle and less less stressed out when everything slows down. So I will probably tolerate a bit more on those locations. I don't know.
But isn't this something you would either get as a data dimension of a query or a filter? Couldn't you say I'm defining an SLO for Europe and I'm defining the same SLO for the US, but then I have a different query? Is this the way you would do it, or would you rather?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
That's how we've done it in the past. We did that exact thing. So you would register a separate grouping thing, and then that would automatically register something that looks like one of your OpenSLO configs. Of course, we ended up going discrete because then the complexities of managing that and updating those as teams want to change them gets pretty heavy. So be wary. I coach teams to more tier things now, where I say try and talk about things in terms of like gold, platinum, silver. And then you can take like core infrastructure services you might run as a service for us, for example, and then you tier them and say, I'm going to offer the high performance offering, the regular offering, and then the high scale offering, which might have slightly less performance. And so that's one way we found success in letting somebody tailor, to Henrik's point, tailor by location, tailor by tiering as well.
We had a conversation about this, like with a client the other day also, because they were asking the same kind of question about like, do we want to have location-based SLOs? Like, does that make sense conceptually? The first kind of proposition I had with them too is like, from an external point of view, does it matter where you like the data and like resources are housed? So like, let's say that like I'm in Canada, I'm hitting like servers in the or I'm sorry, if we have a multi-region setup, does it matter to me? Because then the idea is like, let's say a region goes out or something goes out and I get diverted to traffic or to somewhere else, but that doesn't degrade my experience. Then no, having the location based SLO doesn't matter. For this customer, however, based on geography, they get pushed to different deployments of the application, and those are sticky. So like all US people go to the US, all people that are in Canada go to like the Canadian one, etc. So my experience as a US customer is tied to that deployment's performance. And so in that case, we said, yeah, no, that makes sense to have location-based SLOs.
I was thinking one of the concepts we have in Captain is, as I explained earlier, you have the SLI and SLO separated. So let's assume the easy example. In the SLI, I have response time. In the SLO, I say response time 500 milliseconds. What I can also do in the SLO, I can add an additional filter that should be passed then to the query. So I basically say, I have my SLI, it always stays the same, but it can then use a dynamic filter that is specified on the SLO. So that means I would just replicate the SLO for, let's say, US, Europe, blah, blah, blah. And I'm always referencing the same SLI definition, even though when it's actually executed, it will pass the additional filter context over to the tool that then retrieves the query. But it's nice because the queries always stay the same. The only thing that changes maybe the filter, right? Or that dimension that I'm getting out. So that's one of the options we had in there.
That's really slick. That's really slick. I would have loved to have had that for the stuff we had, because people were using query builders and then ended up having to equivalently copy paste queries to tailor the where clausing. And so, that's pretty handy.
Yeah. I like that a lot. Let's see, what else do we have? Anything else for the roadmap like right now? Because I think we got, these are all really good ideas to put into our roadmap.
For the OSLO, for the tool that validates the specification.
Yes.
I know it's not part of testing how, if the query that has been specified in the SLI or in the SLO file or whatever is working properly. Would that make sense to add that? But that means that you have to basically add for each individual data source connector to the to your OSLO, so then you can validate that you're properly getting the metric that you're looking for. Because it doesn't make sense to, if you validate your specification, but the queries that never retrieve anything, then it doesn't make sense to utilize this as an SLO, because at the end you will just have a problem when you're going to use it.
That's a tough one. Yeah, because I think you're right. We would have to like build in like some sort of like provider for each, or sorry, like a plugin for each provider. I know,
but this is the question, right? I mean, with if you want to validate if a file is up to spec, if this is what we want to achieve, then it's just about the spec validation. If the data that is then in that file makes sense, is another thing, isn't it? Or is this the idea of OSLO, that you also validate that also the data makes sense, that the queries are accurate? I don't think so, right?
no, I think that might be something we don't want to do. I'm thinking of how like Terraform handles it, where like their like validation and linter validates that structurally it's correct, that this is valid Terraform. It will validate it up to a point, but when you actually then go to apply it, that's when you'll get the errors. Like if something is wrong, like if you put the wrong instance class or something like that, that would be kind of one of the more like the provider implementation side of things. And maybe that's the route that we go with that.
Yeah.
Because I think OSLO might validate, or should just validate that structurally this makes sense. This is the shape of the spec. This is adherent to the spec, but it's up to the data source to error that out.
But I mean, will it do basic sanity check? Like if somebody writes select and they put an extra T on the end of select, is it going to catch that or no when it validates? Not does the data source have the data you're querying for, but is the query at least like a valid looking query? Because that's the type of stuff that I would want to build in if I'm validating ours. If I start using this, is that I'm going to immediately want to check and make sure that the base queries I'm using are valid, whether or not the user supplied where clausing would change.
Yeah, I thought about this for prompt quite a bit, and I think that generally makes sense to put in. Like, if you write sum with 2 M's, then yes, that should fail in OSLO. Same as for your example.
But then you will need to be able to extend OSLO, as Ian said, with individual provider specific plugins or whatever. And because the other option that you would have, whatever tool you then use, you could do something like a dry run, or I don't know how they call it in other, right? You can say basically I validated that the syntax is correct, the structure is correct of my SLI and SLO, but before I really want to apply it, let's do a dry run. And this would then reach out to the tool anyway that is doing the query, and then this tool can say, hey, you know what? I don't use select. My language looks completely different, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to do something like give it a plugin architecture to be able to do these potentially. But I'm also thinking about some of the things like doesn't, like New Relic is one that like a lot of our customers use, like we're using Nurquil. I'm just seeing if they have like a linter or anything that we would
because when you in Noble 9 like set up an integration, right, and you let's take New Relic as an example. If your users configured the New Relic query and then you hit the save button, there's no validation. The validation happens at runtime right now, I assume, right? And then maybe an error comes back.
Yeah, so like we hit the API. A lot of the times, like, what we found, there's been issues with, no data source coming back, and it depends on the provider too, whether they give that as an error or this an empty response. So that's been a problem too. They don't always give the most verbose erroring. Like app dynamics is one that I know that'll just return an empty response for either misconfigured or no data. So it looks essentially the same.
Mhm.
This would be handy though, but maybe one thing we can put on here then is to add a plugin, add plugin architectures.
At least a basic sanity check. I agree. I mean, this would be
Yeah.
good, or at least I know it could probably just be regex. I mean, it could be very simple. But I think, as Matthias said, right, if you have two T's in the end and the select, or I'm not sure who said it, this is something you can easily.
But I was thinking also something else. Just the syntax with regex maybe could make sense, but it means that every individual provider will have to provide their list of checks that needs to sort of validate the query. But also maybe just one basic stuff. Do I need the minimal requirements to be able to fulfill the query? So if I need to query, let's say Dynatrace, I need the URL of my tenant. I need an API token. Yeah, just basic stuff. So maybe somewhere putting the required stuff that you need, and then Oslo can say, hey, all right, the SLO seems fine, but at the moment you have no token defined, no URL. So this is never gonna work.
That could actually make a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Like not testing the content of it, like not checking the query itself, checking that the requirements are met, the basic requirements. That makes a lot. That would make a lot of sense, and would probably solve a lot of issues.
Yeah,
and that's also something that I would personally expect in like a linting validation tool and in like CI, so that I can have that fast fail. Okay, put that on there. One of the things I was also thinking about with Oslo, I don't know if I'll put it, I don't know how far off we are. I think we need to have this spec for it, but just at some point, it'd also be nice to have some sort of like bootstrapping option, where it's like, Oslo, like, generate SLO and just ask you the questions, and it'll output in whatever format you want.
That the community is looking for that. That would be awesome.
Yeah. One thing that we had in mind is, because obviously as the community is building SLOs that make sense, maybe also different SLOs for different technology stacks. If you could even say, put the quote unquote best practices on a Git, and then Oslo could say Oslo generate, and then you can basically say, I don't know, Java and XYZ, and then it can pull from the Git repo whatever's up there, kind of the defaults, right? And so you could with this easily manage and extend kind of the default set that it generates.
That's actually one that I've heard a lot, at least not pulling it into Oslo necessarily, but that best practices type repo of like, what does it look like for like my Spring Boot stack? How do I, what's some good baseline queries for that? That's like the #1 question that we get from people, especially as they're adopting SLOs. It's like, what does this look like? And a lot of times I want to go back to the kind of previous frame of reference of just like the golden metrics and things like that. And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, just go ahead, because I'm thinking of another.
Okay.
Another
but yeah, having some like more just hello world best practices definitions in there to help people, and like helpful ideas of, here's a good place to start, here's here's how you can start adopting these, and give them a frame of reference would be good.
So I think for the beginning, it makes sense to put these into the same repository as the OpenSLO spec, because it's like evolving together. In the long term, what we found really amazing with the monitoring mixins that we have in the Prometheus ecosystem was to kind of like reach out, for example, to projects like etcd, and literally put them in there, which is just a bunch of JSON files. And then because kind of like the spec, I suspect, doesn't change as dramatically in the future anymore, these maintainers of projects like etcd can really kind of like take on the SLOs on their own and move them forward, move them along with the project, because ultimately they are writing the software and they should know how kind of like these things work out in the best case scenario, at least. So kind of like, just like kind of like, yeah, reaching out to the projects and basically trying to figure out if they would be willing to maintain it on their own.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just sorry. I'm just catching up on the chat. I'm like looking at the Rob and Andy. Sorry to go back to the synthetic SLI for multi-SLO, the performance signature.
Mm-hmm.
I need to write that.
Yeah, we call it, I mean, whatever you want to call it, right? We've been using this internally, this concept, for many years, and we call it performance signature, where we look at a list of metrics, compare them against a value or against the previous baseline, and then we calculate an overall score. That's what we call the performance signature. And that's what we've kind of, taken as a reference when we implemented Captain, let's say the SLO support in Captain.
And by weighing them, you kind of like multiply them with their weight, and then
exactly. So the default,
come up with one number.
The default weight is 1, and then so let's say if you have 10 metrics, then you can have a total score of 10. But then if you say one metric has 5, then you have a total score of 14 potentially, right? What we also do is we allow to mark one or multiple metrics as key SLOs. So if you, for instance, say, I don't care about all the others, but if this one fails, like let's say if failure rate is higher than 2%, then I don't care how fast it is and how good it is. This is a no-go from a business perspective. So that means you can say the evaluation should fail. So we call this a key SLO as part of the, if you evaluate multiple, calculate and aggregate, then the aggregate will fail if one of those key metrics fails.
Nice. Okay. This is amazing, guys. I will just want to say this has been an awesome conversation. Just being able to like talk to everyone and get all these ideas flowing. This is awesome.
Thank you for getting the conversation started to begin with.
Yeah, man.
So.
I'm really excited that we're able to do this. I think this is something that's needed, and I'm just personally really excited to work on this. Let's see what else.
I was thinking another topic. I don't know if it makes sense in this project or not. But so Noble 9 is one tool that will basically be used to expose the SLO and track them and so on. So also be able to sort of, I have my SLO defined, it's been validated, it's good, we can use it. And then I want to basically track it down somewhere. So if I'm a tester, I maybe would be interested to track and track them in Jira, for example, as a requirement, as a test requirement, for example. If I am more a cloud operator, I will probably store it somewhere else. So basically also being able to, once you have the SLO, have a sort of a tooling that also register those in a third-party product that will basically manage the SLO on daily basis. That will be also interesting as well. I don't know, it's just a suggestion again.
So I have kind of like a separate like repository for the SLOs.
Let's say we have done the OpenSLO because I used the standard format, and I'm using Prometheus as a data source. I'm using OSLO to validate that, and then I'm going to use it. So then once I'm going to use it, I'm probably going to delegate the evaluation to another product. I can use Captain, for instance. I can use Noble 9. So then I want to have the options to, okay, now sync that to the right tool.
Oh, so like I say like let's say like Noble 9 would then ingest that from the separate one.
Yeah.
So like in Noble 9 we would say like, okay, here's where my SLOs live. They live in this separate spot. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. For example, I have a specification and I have a utility like a command line, and then from that
Mhm.
command line, I want to always make sure that, for example, Jira is up to date. So if I change my SLO settings in my YAML file, because someone said we have to change thresholds, then once I do that, I want to make sure that the other stakeholders that you visualize the requirements through Jira, they will be also see that update.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. I think I'm following, but
Just my gut feeling, I feel like that's probably, at least like in the Kubernetes environment, kind of like that would be kind of like a OpenSLO Jira operator that would then kind of reconcile whatever you have updated in these SLO specs, kind of be able to update that in Jira, right? I'm not sure if it's really specific to OpenSLO to begin with, more like how to integrate with other tools.
I think it's not a big thing that we need to do as a early first version. I think we should maybe keep that in our mind, and we can maybe also figure out with the community if they think it's important, then we can prioritize the effort there.
okay.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's awesome. I like that.
One thing specific to the schema, I was wondering if it's like closed or open. So meaning basically, if I were to put additional fields in there, would the spec be invalid, or can I basically, so what I'm kind of thinking of is I specify the SLO, and then maybe I want to tweak something in like a UI or something. So I want to like say, okay, like match this regex for all 200 status codes to display these as green in the UI or whatever, right? So kind of like putting additional data into the spec that's specific to an actual implementation, but if like the OpenSLO would allow for something like that, or if it should actually fail.
So the way that we were envisioning it was that it would be extended by other providers, other vendors, other implementers. And so I think it's open in that way, because and we shouldn't fail it for that, because there's going to be like implementation details that we'll want to add to it potentially. Like I was saying earlier, like for us, like, you know, we have to configure the agents, so we have to configure how that those data sources are fetched, and so there's slight differences that we may need to add in there. So I think that it makes sense to say that this is open in the sense that, you know, the validation should not fail if there's extra fields in there.
Right. So yeah, making it kind of like the minimum requirement to be compliant, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe I wasn't just like too sure about this myself. So more of a user question, I guess. Yeah.
No, I think I don't know. I don't think we call that out specifically. So I think that might be something we want to put in the spec about the intention. And again, that could be something that's up to debate for the community. I'm just saying that's how we were envisioning it. I don't want there to I don't want to close any doors on this.
Right.
Yeah, because like one of the things that we've been talking about is like, you know, because our spec is, you know, there's been enough kind of drift between like what Noble 9 uses and OpenSLO. You know, we're talking about like having like a tool that is able to output our Noble 9 YAML files or, you know, manifests as OpenSLO. So to kind of reinforce that portability. Because, again, there's going to be, and I think there will always be a state at which we have extra information in there, again, for the implementation. So at least having like our slow cuddle tool being able to pull down your SLOs and then output that in an OpenSLO format. That's one of the things we also can think about.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'll just add that as an item in here.
Hey, I need to drop as well because I have one more call coming up and I need to prepare something for it.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we'll have another one in about a month.
Yeah. And for the Europeans, tonight you gotta vote for Austria and not for Holland.
Oh, don't tell Hidalgo that.
Is it tonight? Austria's been?
It's in an hour.
Yeah.
An hour? Okay, so I'm going.
Well, the thing is, I know I'm going to be drunk probably either because of joy or because of depression. We'll see.
Yeah, Hidalgo's from Holland, so like he's all about it.
Okay.
I will probably tease you in WhatsApp.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
See ya. Bye-bye.
See ya.
All right. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great one.
You too.